Thanks. So I'm Spencer, and with Claire, we have been rebuilding computational biomechanics crate by crate. And we are both grad students at Rice University, but today we're representing the Biomechanics Foundation that we're starting up with some of our ideas. So to give you a little bit more background in what biomechanics actually is, we're interested in the study of physiological movement, which is mostly humans for our case. So this is applications in healthcare, which is more of our background, athletic performance, and entertainment for if you've seen like motion capture in games or movies, this all kind of comes into play there. When you're in biomechanics, you use motion capture and force plate data mainly, and EMG if you're interested in muscle activity. And our goal, really more in the healthcare space, is to understand the dynamics of injury and motion impairments. So if somebody has had a stroke, we want to see where they're struggling to move and potentially what we can do about it with our physical knowledge of their impairment. So the current software in the computational biomechanics space, there is some different projects that some labs have, but primarily people are using OpenSim, which is C++ software that you can see the GUI tools for it down at this image at the bottom. And even though C++ is kind of the main language of biomechanics because of this project, there actually aren't a ton of labs that are writing C++ in biomechanics because we tend to be more from the experimentalist side of things, and so there aren't as many programmers in the space. So C++ is not very approachable for a lot of people, and it makes writing new tools pretty difficult. So most people that are doing programming in computational biomechanics in the research space are writing scripts in Python and MATLAB using C++ APIs. So there's a lot of functionality that's not as accessible to people, and there are a lot of limitations in what people are able to do. OpenSim as software has enabled a lot of good research in the community, but we want to see what we can do with Rust potentially to try to open up some more advanced and different kinds of tools that can all be integrated into the same sort of GUI tools. So we've seen a lot of cool opportunities in Rust. We're both fairly new to Rust relatively, but it's pretty clear, if you're here, you're probably very familiar with some of these very cool things about Rust that make it an attractive language. It's really easy to develop and distribute software through Cargo and crates.io. Those both make that really nice. It's a lot easier than compiling C++. And actually with OpenSim, uh, pretty much nobody is compiling the GUI tool on their own because, as it's become a very complex project, C++ gets harder to manage than Rust. And we're hoping that with Rust, that'll help us scale up really easily and run on any kind of machine. The error handling is also really attractive in Rust. I think the C++ does a decent job of error handling, but you have a lot of people, including in our lab, who are writing scripts again in Python and MATLAB. And we get into some really confusing sorts of errors with scripting language working with the C++ API. And so when you're working directly in Rust and we want to handle the errors and again, make the GUI tools more accessible for development, that should make that a lot easier for users. We also find that through Rust, it is a lot more sensible to do new implementations of legacy code rather than just using external C crates for certain things or C projects. And that sounds like it's more work kind of up front, but we'll get into with some of the software we actually want to use why that ends up being a big deal and really helpful. Rust also has a really modern growing infrastructure we're excited about. Like we know that we're not the only ones here using Bevy, and we're also using eGUI to develop our GUI tools. So it's really nice to have that accessible while we're building our new biomechanics part of the tools. So Chiron has become our flagship software project, and we're mainly interested in these 6 areas, which we aren't into quite all of these yet, but eventually we'd love to do all sorts of data processing for biomechanics, inverse kinematics to study how bodies move, inverse dynamics to study more the physics behind it, muscle activity, we want to tell more what's going on physiologically to get that movement eventually. Model personalization will let us refine some of our ideas about how people are moving and how the bodies are working. And finally, we'd like to get into dynamic gait simulation to try to make predictions about how people are moving. And we decided again to start, we're going back to basics. Let's look at how we process biomechanical data. The main file type for biomechanics data is the C3D file. Whenever you do a motion capture session, even if you have force plate data, and EMG data, it all gets stored into one C3D file. C3D was a specification designed about 40 years ago to contain all experimental data you're ever going to have in biomechanics. And if that sounds ambitious, that's because it really is. It's pretty ambiguous too when it gets down to it because it tries to do so much. It was, designed assuming all the manufacturers would get on board, nobody would change their mind about how biomechanics data collection works. And so there's a lot of ambiguity, different ways things can be handled that gets very tricky. For Rust, that seems like something we're able to handle. People, manufacturers mainly will just throw basically whatever they want into the C3D file. But with Rust, when we write a file parser, we have to know ahead of time what can happen and have some idea of how we want to handle it, no matter what sort of specification they've used in the file, which of the 4 types of force plates or various types of handling analog data like EMG data they've used, we need to know what to do about it. When people are working in MATLAB, though, that tends to be more chaotic. So a lot of people have trouble with C3D files because they just kind of have to take their best guess, and they don't have these things to leverage in Rust like enums. So we find that while a lot of programmers in the biomechanics space will find scripting languages more convenient, it actually ends up saving you a lot of trouble down the line to use a strongly typed language to try to parse biomechanics data. And with Setio, this is where our first GUI tools come in. So you can see a preview of what that's looking like right now, where we have biomechanics data loaded in a GUI tool in Rust. So this was very exciting to kind of open the door to biomechanics in Rust and then move into some of our more data processing tools from there. So GCV splines are a type of spline that you can use to fit data that are the main way biomechanists have interpolated data and taken derivatives of data for a very long time. Taking derivatives is really important for us because if we're going to do dynamics, we need to take our position data and get velocity and acceleration out of that to be dynamically consistent. So I started with GCV spline by looking at what current code is out there that people use. And fortunately, we don't have to write all this from scratch. There's Fortran code, but its call is pretty complicated. I honestly don't remember most of what's going on here. There's a lot of inputs. The math works great, but it's not the most accessible. But fortunately, this was rewritten in C a few years later. We still have a lot of inputs here, and it's interesting how I started to get into with the C code. There's a lot of older programming conventions here that just haven't been updated because basically everybody that uses GCV splines uses this C version, and they'll wrap it for some other language or they'll just package it with something else. But there's a lot of unclear stuff with these inputs here and things that just aren't necessary. Like it asks you to put a working vector of exactly the right size for it to do all the computations within. So we updated this a little for Rust, and this top function call here, even though it only has 5 arguments, will replicate all the functionality of the Fortran code in the C code. And even still, most people will just want this simpler call that only takes time and data vectors in the bottom to do their data fitting for their splines and interpolation derivatives. So applying modern conventions to time-tested code has been really helpful for us and a really cool experience. And similarly, Butterworth filters are also taken for granted. It is a type of filter mainly used for low-pass filtering to smooth out experimental data. You can see an example of unfiltered and filtered data here on the right. And they're kind of taken for granted in SciPy and MATLAB. It's pretty easy. You just call filtfilt basically. There are existing filters in Rust, but they're not quite like filtfilt because they have filtfilt has this zero phase lag specialty. You can see that the data doesn't get shifted left or right after filtering. That's really important for us. And we also need to be able to set an arbitrary order for the filter, which, yeah, again, is easy in filtfilt or in MATLAB's version. But if we try to trace how filtfilt actually works to try to replicate it perfectly, a lot of the functionality is actually buried in compiled C code that's kind of inaccessible. And if we also try to look at MATLAB's implementation, that's completely invisible because MATLAB is a proprietary language, so we can't see how they write it at all. And it turns out the best way to handle this is to go back to basics and see what's going on with the linear algebra. Because the part of the code that was so obscured in SciPy that I couldn't get to can be implemented in about 10 lines in Rust. It's fairly straightforward linear algebra, but you wouldn't know it from how it's treated. I can see why people don't rewrite this all the time because it's been so obscured, taken for granted. Most people using it are sticking to data science scripting languages like Python and MATLAB. But if we're going to write biomechanics from the beginning, we have to be really conscious of our data science and our numerical methods. So with Chiron, we are pretty happy with how data processing is all coming along. So we're starting to move more into inverse kinematics and inverse dynamics, get into the physics simulations. So that's where Onager comes in. That's our current crate in development. That is our physics engine. This is the most back to basics, literal textbook dynamics. We have the textbook that everybody references for physics engines. So that's where we're in now with physics simulation. With physical bodies, this is something else we're looking at. We want to look at what data structure is the best for bodies. So OpenSim uses lists of bodies, but we want to try to preserve more of the structure. A graph seems pretty intuitive based on how these bodies work and how they connect. But with Rust, there's some complications with graphs. We want to not have too many problems with overlapping ownership. So we're leaning towards trees that avoid loops. We have to be conscious of constraints. In the future, we're looking at modeling more physiological components. So for muscles and ligaments, that's going to be the dynamics of muscles and how the geometry connects across bodies. So how do you process the line of action of a muscle? We're going to look at cartilage contact modeling. A lot of researchers are interested in this to see how loading works inside joints. So contact modeling is one of our future work areas. We also want to support more physiological types of joints. So physics engines will usually support pretty simple stuff like hinges, which the knee is pretty close to. But if you want to do something like the shoulder, that's going to require some pretty complex constraints. And we also want to look at neural control models. This is something that has become really important in biomechanics research. That OpenSim, the software development team we've talked to, they've had some issues with implementing neural control just because it's kind of a new thing that wasn't accounted for several years ago. So we want to be conscious of our new biomechanics knowledge. All this is to get to eventually optimal control simulations, which are ways that we can use dynamically consistent ways to simulate gait and make predictions about how people are going to move with their control structures. And this will be what lets us predict how people are going to move and predict how potentially treatment options for people with movement impairments are going to work. And people that do this in current biomechanics, really, it's the cutting edge of biomechanics research right now. But it's pretty difficult because everyone kind of has their own setup for it, and there are no GUI tools to do this all in one place. So by having everything in one language in one place in Rust, we want to make this really straightforward and something that even in the clinic you could try out. So if you're interested in what we're working in either software side or if you're just interested in biomechanics, these are the sites where we're going to be posting our updates as things come along. And thank you for inviting me to this conference.
Well, thank you very much, Spencer. There is a question for you in Q&A, but I was wondering, can you use this for video game engines, for instance?
Yeah,
Is
so that's what I mentioned at the beginning.
uh,
Yeah, so our areas that we're interested in, we kind of come from a healthcare background, but we
mm,
want to support healthcare athletics and entertainment. I didn't mention it here, but there is a fourth crate we have that Claire worked on called Bevy C3D.
mm.
And she would, yeah, really like to support having motion capture data that can then be put into Bevy and used to get really interesting like motion capture for NPCs, stuff like that, animations and games.